The air in the hearing room was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable hum that intensified with every hushed whisper and carefully positioned phone. It was 10:03 a.m., and the stage was set for a political showdown that would redefine accountability. At its center sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, radiating a calm born of battles fought and won from being consistently underestimated. Across from her, Karoline Leavitt, polished and poised, held a smile that felt more like armor than genuine warmth. Everyone expected a routine discussion on media integrity, but Jasmine's quiet placement of a red folder on the table signaled a different kind of fight was about to begin. This wasn't about shouting, it was about showing. Karoline Leavitt used her marriage to sell values. Jasmine used Karoline's own words to expose contradictions, and did it all without ever crossing the line. The hearing room was packed by 10:03 a.m., not just with people, but with tension, the kind that builds slowly, quietly, and doesn't let go. You could feel it in the way the reporters positioned their phones, how aides whispered into each other's ears a little too long. Everyone was waiting for something, even if they didn't know what. At the center of the room, under the harsh glow of recessed lighting, Representative Jasmine Crockett sat still, arms crossed. Her expression didn't give much away. She looked alert, but not tense, focused, but not fidgety, the kind of calm you only learn when you've been underestimated too many times. Just across from her, Karoline Leavitt adjusted her blazer for the third time in as many minutes. Her smile was intact, tight, polished, just like her whole image. Former Trump spokeswoman, conservative firebrand, married to a finance executive from New Hampshire. She had the credentials, the narrative, the media training. But something about this morning felt different. The committee was gathered for a scheduled discussion on media integrity and the role of misinformation in public discourse. Dry title, routine topic. Cameras were present, but no one expected fireworks. At least not until Jasmine gently slid a red folder in front of her. She didn't even open it yet, just placed it down with a kind of quiet finality that caught Karoline's eye. Chairman Lewis called the hearing to order. The room settled. Introductions were made. A few opening remarks trickled in. Typical policy points, failed jabs, the usual theater. Then the chair nodded toward Jasmine. Representative Crockett, you have 5 minutes. She nodded once and leaned toward her mic. Thank you, Mr. Chair. She didn't even glance at Karoline. Instead, her eyes scanned the room like she was making sure everyone else was listening before she said what she needed to say. We've talked a lot about how the public perceives truth, how it's shaped, filtered, and presented by public figures. And today, I'd like to bring clarity to a very specific example. Her tone didn't change, still steady, still measured. In the past 6 months, Representative Leavitt has spoken frequently about her marriage, on national television, on podcasts, and at fundraisers. She's used her relationship to highlight her values, to contrast herself with others, and to justify positions on policy, ranging from family leave to school funding. Karoline blinked once. Her smile stayed, but her body shifted in the seat, a small lean forward. One hand on the desk now, Jasmine continued. But when we put public statements side by side, when we actually listen to what's being said, it becomes harder to reconcile the facts. Now she opened the folder. 1 week before the midterms, Representative Leavitt told KZN Austin that she and her husband had relocated to Dallas temporarily for his consulting work. But just 3 weeks later, at a fundraiser in Boise, she spoke about maintaining a long-distance marriage for the past 2 years while living in New Hampshire full-time. 2 very different versions of a very personal story, used for very specific audiences. She turned a page. There's a podcast interview from Tampa, February 14th, Valentine's Day. She says, and I quote, "We've never spent a Valentine's apart in 8 years." But her own Instagram, now wiped, shows she was attending a summit in Nevada that same week solo. That post was deleted last month. Karoline interjected. This is completely inappropriate. But the chair raised his hand. Representative Leavitt, you'll have your time. Jasmine didn't flinch. I'm not sharing anything that wasn't already shared by you. What I'm doing is listening and comparing the stories you've given to the public with the facts you've put out there yourself. She didn't raise her voice once. No accusations, just a steady current of contradictions laid out like puzzle pieces being quietly assembled. And the room was dead still. But what came next would make even the reporters stop writing. Karoline's fingers tapped against her binder, light at first, then faster. The smile she wore at the start of the hearing was still there, but now it looked more like armor than anything else. Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't need to. The red folder on the table looked plain. No markings, no labels. But every page, Jasmine turned added weight to the air. "Let's talk about the fundraiser in Boise," she said, her voice still calm. Representative Leavitt spoke about the strength of her marriage. She said, and again I quote, "My husband and I made a commitment to never live apart. No matter where duty calls us, we're together." Jasmine paused just long enough to let the words settle. But public travel records from January to April show her flying solo to 5 different states. Not once was her husband on the manifest. And while that may not seem like much, when you place it beside what's been said publicly, it starts to feel like part of a pattern. Karoline glanced toward her aide seated behind her. The aide didn't move. In politics, we all try to relate to the public. That's part of the job. But it becomes dangerous when the image we present to connect with voters begins to look less like a life and more like a story. Karoline spoke up, her voice edged with frustration. "You're making something out of nothing. This is personal. My marriage is not public property." Jasmine turned her eyes on Karoline for the first time. "You made it part of your platform. You used it to back legislation on family values, to criticize other members, and to paint yourself as a moral alternative. That makes it relevant." A quiet murmur stirred in the back rows. Staffers exchanged looks. Someone leaned over to whisper, but Jasmine's voice cut right through it. "You said your husband left corporate finance to join a nonprofit in Dallas, but IRS records show the nonprofit was dissolved last year, and at the same month you made that statement, he registered a new company in Tampa under his own name. The address on file. A condo you said publicly you never lived in." Karoline opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Jasmine closed the folder slowly. "I'm not accusing you of anything illegal. I'm not even judging your marriage. But when the story shifts, depending on who's in the room, we owe it to the public to ask why." Silence, a long one. The chairman cleared his throat. "Representative Crockett, you have 1 minute remaining." She nodded, then took a slow breath. "This isn't about digging into someone's private life. It's about accountability. If you're using your personal life as a campaign tool, you owe it to the public to be consistent. Because when the story doesn't line up, it's not just a personal matter anymore. It's a question of credibility." Karoline sat motionless, staring ahead like she was doing mental damage control in real time. Jasmine adjusted her microphone one last time. No further comments. She leaned back in her chair, and just like that, the first round was over. But silence doesn't last long when cameras are rolling and facts start to land harder than fists. The moment the chairman thanked Jasmine for her remarks, you could hear the collective shuffle. Papers being straightened, chairs creaking slightly, reporters hurrying to catch their thoughts, but no one said a word. The energy in the room had shifted. You could feel it pressing against the walls like heat. Karoline didn't speak right away. She looked frozen, not in fear, but in calculation. Her lips pressed together so tightly they had lost all color. One hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. When she finally leaned into her microphone, the sound of her voice cracked just slightly, but she covered it with force. "I think it's incredibly sad that we've reached a point where a person's marriage can be dissected like a campaign talking point." Her tone was firm now, sharp, meant to sting. "This is nothing more than a targeted smear dressed up as concern for the public. I will not stand here and have my family life twisted into a political spectacle." She looked around seeking support, but even her usual allies on the panel weren't meeting her eye. Some just stared at their notepads. Others were clearly watching Jasmine, who didn't move, didn't react. "I love my husband," Karoline continued, louder this time. "We've made sacrifices. We've been through things none of you know about, and I will not apologize for protecting the parts of my life that matter most." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, but stayed quiet. Then Representative Alton Briggs from Michigan a moderate who usually kept his head down, spoke. "No one's asking you to apologize for protecting your marriage," he said. "But what we heard today were public claims that don't match public records. That's not an invasion. That's accountability." Karoline's head whipped toward him. "Are you saying you believe this nonsense?" Briggs stayed composed. "I'm saying we all chose to put our lives under a microscope when we ran for office. If we use our stories to build trust, we can't complain when people start checking the math. It wasn't just the words, it was who said them." Briggs wasn't known for grandstanding. He didn't stir the pot, but now he'd stirred something. Jasmine finally spoke again, quiet but clear. "I didn't bring anything private into this room. I brought only what was already public, what you chose to share. The facts don't care whether they're convenient." Karoline didn't answer. She stared at her notes, flipping through pages she clearly wasn't reading. And then Jasmine reached into the folder one last time, a single sheet this time, one document. "This," she said, holding it up without fanfare, "is a screenshot of a now-deleted post from Representative Leavitt's personal blog dated April 2019. In it, she mentions attending marriage counseling while living apart for 8 months. She placed it gently on the desk. Yet for the past year, she's told voters she's never been separated from her husband. Those are my words. Those are hers. Ding te hon hen lanai, sop ons, boot thou." Karoline stood up. "Mr. Chairman, I will not sit here while my name is dragged through the mud under the guise of public interest. This is character assassination." The chairman didn't blink. "Representative Leavitt, please sit down." Karoline didn't move for a moment. Then she slowly lowered herself back in her chair, eyes locked on Jasmine. But Jasmine was already closing the red folder. She didn't need to say another word. But outside that room, the silence wouldn't last. It wouldn't be Karoline who controlled the story anymore. The hearing adjourned 10 minutes later, but no one was really paying attention to the closing statements. Jasmine stayed quiet. She didn't touch the folder again. She didn't gloat, didn't glance toward the cameras. She just waited until it was over, then rose, collected her papers, and left the room like it was any other Thursday. Karoline stayed behind. Her team swarmed her the second they had clearance. Whispers, pulled phones, panic glances. You could see it, the scramble. A machine built on precision, suddenly tripping over its own script. But the real shift didn't happen inside that room. It started minutes after Jasmine's walkout, on a Twitter thread from a political reporter named Devin Heath, who was sitting in the second row. His tweet was simple. "I've covered Karoline Leavitt for 5 years. I've never seen her rattled like that." Jasmine Crockett didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She just showed. And the silence in that room, that was the sound of something breaking. The tweet exploded. Clips from the hearing went viral in less than an hour. But it wasn't the interruptions or the raised voices that trended. It was Jasmine's steady tone, the facts she laid out, and the way Karoline reacted, like the ground under her feet had shifted an inch too far. By the time evening hit, the story had a life of its own. Local affiliates started pulling old interviews. Social media users dug up more posts Karoline had deleted. Anniversary photos with mismatched captions. 2 separate wedding dates mentioned a year apart. Tax documents that didn't list her as married at all until 2020, even though she'd claimed they'd been together since 2016. And then it happened. A small regional outlet out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, published a piece. It included a scanned record from the county clerk's office, a marriage license issued in 2019 to Karoline Leavitt and a man named Ewan Rohr. But in 2020, a legal name change was filed for Ewan only, backdated to 2016. No public explanation, just paperwork. The license and the backdate didn't match anything Karoline had ever said in interviews. Not the dates, not the names, not the cities. People weren't just confused, they were suspicious. Podcasters began speculating. Cable panels tried to stay neutral, but their segments ended in awkward pauses. Even conservative commentators were asking why she hadn't just clarified the record from the start. Inside Karoline's camp, things were tense. Sources close to her told reporters she was reevaluating how personal information was shared. One aide, off the record, said, "We thought nobody would check." She told the story so many times it became true to her. Meanwhile, Jasmine said nothing. She didn't tweet. She didn't book interviews. When asked for comment by the Boston Globe, she replied through her press secretary, "Everything I said was public record. The rest is up to the people to decide." It wasn't just political anymore. It was personal, and not in the way Karoline had claimed earlier in the day. This wasn't about attacking a marriage. It was about something deeper, trust. The kind of trust voters give you when they assume your story is real, even when they disagree with your politics. And now that trust had a crack in it, right down the middle. But before the public could decide how deep that crack went, someone from inside Karoline's own world spoke up. And that's when things really started to shift. By sunrise the next morning, Karoline's team was trying to plug holes in a ship that was already halfway underwater. They pushed out a carefully worded statement just after 6 a.m., one that danced around the facts without denying them. It read, "Representative Leavitt is proud of her family, her marriage, and her privacy. In an era of relentless political attacks, she remains focused on policy and the values she brings to the American people." But the timing wasn't the problem. The tone was. People weren't upset because she had personal complexities. They were upset because she'd spent years building a spotless image and used that image as proof of her moral standing. When cracks appeared, the silence felt dishonest. Comment sections were filled with former supporters asking, "Why not just tell the truth?" Others wondered if the whole story had ever been hers to begin with. Then, in a surprising turn, a man named Owen Grayson, Karoline's former communications director, posted a thread of his own. It was measured, respectful, but sharp. "I worked with Karoline Leavitt for 14 months. I saw how hard she worked, how fiercely she protected her story, but sometimes that protection blurred into control. We edited statements, removed old posts, even rewrote her campaign bio 3 times to clean up personal timelines. Not for deception, for optics." That word, optics, hit like a punch. It confirmed what people already suspected, that the version of Karoline they had been sold was curated down to the minute. The story now had 2 lives. On the surface, a political figure weathering public scrutiny. But underneath, a woman who may have rewritten parts of her life, not to deceive, but to manage how she was seen. Jasmine, still silent, had returned to Texas. She was seen in Fort Worth, attending a veterans breakfast, talking to constituents, shaking hands. When asked about the hearing, she only said, "I said what I said, that's all." Cable networks couldn't get enough. One panelist said Jasmine's approach had redefined confrontation. Another called it the most damaging 5 minutes of political theater in years, without a single insult. The silence from Jasmine became louder than any statement Karoline made. It looked intentional. It looked strong. Back in New Hampshire, pressure was mounting. Local media outlets ran front pages that read, "What's real? Story or strategy?" When personal becomes political. But then came something unexpected. On a Friday evening, a small podcast with only a few thousand listeners uploaded a new episode. The guest was someone calling herself a relative of Representative Leavitt's husband. She didn't use her real name. The podcast verified her identity, but agreed to keep her anonymous. Her voice was steady, not dramatic. She didn't accuse Karoline of being a bad person, but she told a story. She's smart. She's determined. She always had a plan. But even back at family gatherings, she'd rehearse things like actual conversations. We'd be sitting at dinner, and she'd stop mid-sentence and say, "Wait, that's not how I want to say it." She didn't know how to just be. It was always a message, even when nobody asked. The host asked if the marriage was real. "I believe they love each other," the woman said after a long pause. But it was never simple, and she didn't want anyone to know that, especially not voters. The episode caught fire overnight. It wasn't scandalous, it was intimate. It painted Karoline not as a liar, but as someone afraid to be seen as flawed, and that somehow made things worse. People weren't mad now. They were disappointed. Meanwhile, Jasmine still hadn't posted a single word online. No tweets, no press tours, no leaks, just silence. But in the court of public opinion, silence can speak louder than any press release. And Karoline was learning that too late. By Monday, the damage wasn't just public. It was personal. Karoline's husband, Mitchell Rohr, hadn't made a single appearance since the hearing. Not on social media, not in public. He was always private, but now that privacy felt like distance. Fast. Was he out of the state? Were they living separately? Was the marriage a name only? Her office tried to shut it down. They claimed he was simply avoiding the media circus. But insiders told a different story. A staffer from her campaign, who quit the same week, said Mitchell hadn't attended a single official event with her in over 6 months. He's tired of the image, the former staffer said anonymously. He didn't sign up to be a prop. He didn't mind being invisible until she made him part of the message. Even Karoline's closest allies in Congress had gone quiet. Her phone calls weren't being returned as quickly. Endorsements she'd counted on were suddenly under review. She was still showing up to sessions, still smiling in front of cameras, but the spark was gone. And then came the moment no one expected. A local ABC affiliate in New Hampshire obtained audio from a private GOP donor event recorded weeks before the hearing. In it, Karoline could be heard telling a small group of supporters, "They'll never touch me. I've cleaned up every piece of my story. There's nothing left to spin." The clip was barely 30 seconds long, but it was devastating. The confidence, the calculation, the way she referred to her own life like a brand strategy, it erased whatever benefit of the doubt remained. People didn't just see her as dishonest now. They saw her as disconnected. And yet, Jasmine never commented. No press statements, no Instagram lives, no midnight tweets, just silence. That silence, though, didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like strategy, a quiet form of strength. Reporters reached out over and over. Jasmine's press office kept giving the same response. Representative Crockett stands by the public record. She has nothing to add. Behind the scenes, her own team had been flooded with support. Constituents thanking her for her calm. Staffers from other offices messaging her chief of staff just to say, "That was masterful." One veteran senator who had been in politics since the 70s pulled her aside and said, "You didn't raise your voice, but you raised the bar." Meanwhile, Karoline was trying to reframe the narrative. She appeared on a conservative talk show out of Phoenix, seated stiffly in front of a flag backdrop. "They came from my family," she said, eyes glassy. "They used my marriage to humiliate me, and it wasn't about facts. It was about tearing me down because I represent values they hate." But the host hesitated. "Do you feel like some of the confusion came from your own storytelling?" he asked carefully. Karoline's smile faltered for a second. "I gave people the version of my life that helped them understand me," she replied. "That's not deception. That's connection." But that answer, meant to be redemptive, landed poorly. Viewers didn't want connection through performance. They wanted honesty through imperfection. And Jasmine's silence continued to grow louder. At a church town hall in Dallas, a woman in her 70s stood up and said into the mic, "You didn't shout. You didn't threaten. You just read what she gave the world. That's how you beat a lie, by staying calm and letting the truth walk out on its own." Jasmine smiled quietly. She didn't deny it. She didn't amplify it. But what came next was something even Karoline's team hadn't prepared for, and it wouldn't be spoken in a hearing room or typed into a tweet. The headlines faded faster than expected. A week after the storm, national media had moved on to a different scandal in Arizona. Late-night hosts stopped cracking jokes. The hashtags stopped trending. But something deeper had shifted, and it didn't go away with the news cycle. Karoline was still in office. She hadn't resigned, hadn't been censured. But every speech, every bill she introduced, now carried an invisible question mark. People watched her with a kind of second-guessing that didn't exist before. They smiled less, clapped shorter, some just looked through her. She tried to reset her image with a video on her campaign site, shot outside in soft natural light with her dog in the background. She didn't directly address the marriage rumors, but spoke of commitment, values, and growing in public. It was polished, professional, but that was the problem. It was still trying. And then there was Jasmine. She never claimed to win. She never mentioned Karoline by name again. She just got back to work, held listening sessions in her district, met with teachers about classroom budgets, helped a local barbershop apply for grant funding the same way she always had. But people noticed something had changed, not in how Jasmine acted, but how others looked at her. She wasn't just respected anymore. She was trusted. At a college panel in Austin, a young woman stood up during the Q&A and said, "I watched the hearing. You didn't destroy her. You just made space for the truth to walk in." Jasmine didn't smile at that. She just nodded. Then she said, "Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is not play the game the way they expect you to." She didn't mean it as a headline. She meant it like someone who had learned early that composure isn't weakness, it's strategy. This narrative offers a compelling lesson in public accountability and the enduring power of truth and trust. What Jasmine Crockett demonstrated goes beyond a simple political win. It's a masterclass in composure, meticulous preparation, and the critical importance of consistency. Despite Karoline Leavitt's carefully constructed image and attempts to control her narrative, the inherent contradictions in her public statements and private facts eventually surfaced. Ultimately, truth, however buried or obscured, possesses an innate ability to reveal itself. Furthermore, when public figures leverage personal stories to build their image and solicit trust, they invite scrutiny. Consequently, a breach of that trust, even seemingly minor, can lead to profound and lasting consequences that are difficult to repair. Moreover, Jasmine Crockett consciously avoided emotional outbursts or direct accusations. Instead, she systematically presented facts and evidence with a calm, measured delivery. This approach shows that in the face of misinformation, allowing the truth to speak for itself, unburdened by histrionics, is often the most impactful way to communicate. In addition, in our hyper-connected, often noisy information landscape, Jasmine's deliberate silence after the hearing became a powerful act. This allowed the public to process the information, form their own conclusions, and underscored the weight of the evidence presented without further rhetorical manipulation. Finally, the stark contrast between Karoline's public narrative and verifiable public records severely eroded her credibility. The key lesson here is that consistency is paramount, not just in policy positions, but in how one presents their personal story to the public. Indeed, when the story doesn't align, it transforms from a personal matter into a profound question of trustworthiness. The unfolding of events for Karoline Leavitt and Jasmine Crockett serves as a stark reminder that in the modern era, checking the math on personal narratives has become an integral part of public accountability. What does this story tell you about the future of political discourse and the role of transparency?